Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. Welcome back to Social Confoes. I'm your host, Diego, together with my co host, Sean-Luc. Sean-Luc, welcome back to August 1st.
Wow, time just flies when you're having fun, I guess. So, without further ado, first we have to give you a heads up. As you can see, the scroller, the ticker below, we have migrated to youtube.com/confos. That means that all the social confos episodes can be found on confos on YouTube. But don't forget to follow us on Instagram as well, because we have started with IG with Confoes, and we hopefully will continue in August with some regular updates and some regular content updates, both from the Confoes pages as from our pages as well. We are already at episode 124, and we're doing a batch of episodes where we have no guest. That might come to a close pretty soon. So we're enjoying this ride and enjoying the fact that we get to talk a little bit about topics that are sometimes not the most general topics you would talk about. So, when you think of national identity and patriotism, Diego, what would the first thing be that comes to your mind from your perspective?
So, when I hear that national identity and patriotism, let's just focus on the first part first national identity. I think it's, where the location or whereabouts you identify most with, or you got brought up, or you basically live and work. And if you have if you have a born relationship with that location, or if it's something that you grew into at a later stages in your life, that's totally dependent on you. And some people have very strong roots, not just national identity but also ethnic identity, going back to even historical roots. But coming back to national identity, I would say it's the place you identify with most in a empathic sense, but in a more governmental official sense, it's basically where you have your passport. So,
Where you have your
and
passport. Okay, yeah, go ahead, go ahead,
yeah,
continue.
and to connect this to patriotism, basically, we were looking for a different word because we came out with pride first, the pride for your country, the pride for representing your country, basically the loyalty you have or the devotion that you express through it. So it's an it's a mix between, yeah, you have the formalities and also the feeling that goes with it. So those are two things how I approach it and view it.
Okay, you can go you can go quite far with this. So, first off, there's the saying, you rather have a good neighbor than a faraway friend. And that also ties to the concept of like the culture and the identity. And I think it's interesting because we are taught so much about the globalized world, but then especially when COVID struck, there was kind of the sense like, okay, I need to have a fixed space. I have to have something that I call home, and that's often where identity starts at home. It's the parents you grew up with, but it's also kind of the occupation that you have. That's like the basic civilization. We talked a couple of episodes about the pyramid of Maslow. It comes back down to the identity part. And why I found this really interesting is because throughout your life you get a lot of situations where you get to deal with pride and national identity. The reason we didn't go for pride is because pride now it has a different kind of connotation at the moment than patriotism. And this topic came about for several different reasons. I think the first reason it came about, which I didn't realize until much later, is my background in social science and the IBM research that was done by Geert Hofstede. So Geert Hofstede was
Also,
somebody,
another interesting topic that
yeah,
we often refer to, a
yeah,
module or framework, right?
yeah, was a researcher at IBM, and it's not considered scientific research, but it is considered a very important framework in the difference in national culture. So the difference between cultures from different countries when it comes to feminine or masculine culture. So is it more a masculine society where men have to be men, and there's a very stereotypical role of the men in the household and in the men in the workplace, whereas a more feminine culture has more, it's more equally distributed. There's more things that men do that are considered traditionally considered women roles, and more things that women do that are traditionally considered women roles. Then you have the power distance. I think the power distance is one of the more important ones. Whereas with countries with a high power distance, like somebody who's considered more powerful and in a higher position than you is considered up there, and others are considered a little bit below. So, for instance, if you would have a country with a high power distance, that would mean that the CEO or the managers of the company, they would have a separate parking space. They would have a big, how would you call it, a bigger office. Those kind of things, better wages, those kind of things. Then you also have some risk avoidance or uncertainty avoidance, and there are national cultures that have uh, low uncertainty of a risk avoidance, a low risk of low risk. Can you bring it up a little closer? Then I can, then I don't
Sure.
stumble in my words. So the tradition was uncertainty avoidance, masculinity, power distance, and individualistic collective. So for uncertainty avoidance, low uncertainty avoidance is you don't worry too much about uncertainty. Whereas a high uncertainty avoidance, you're like very worried about being in a situation where everything is uncertain.
Yeah,
And
you're
then,
not willing to take risk. And I brought up basically you can just go to the website, the Hofstede website, and I
this is
got this
beautiful,
during my time
by
in
the
the
way.
university.
Okay,
And I brought up Suriname, the Netherlands, and Singapore just to have three different distinct regions and cultures to have a comparison as you were going through the different
okay.
categories.
Let's go for individualism, collectivism first, because low individualism is high collectivism. Collectivism being like you do everything as a group and you do everything together. High individualism is, I mean, you're on your own in society.
Yeah,
So
basically you can
let's,
see that with Orange,
yeah,
yeah, the
yeah.
Netherlands. It's very individualistic.
Okay, so let's go for and then long term orientation, short term orientation was also a very important one. Indulgence is kind of new.
Yeah,
Long
they
term
expanded with
orientation is
that. Yeah.
also new. But let's start off at power distance. So as you can easily see in the Netherlands, it's very common to refer to somebody who has a higher status than you by their first name. It's not frowned upon. Um, you don't you don't have that, like the person that you're working above you or your boss is kind of, it's not like, oh my god, it's my boss, there's nothing I can say. Whereas
Yeah,
in
it's
Suriname,
basically a very personal level. Yeah.
in this you can see the scores. 100 is like max. 85, it already shows you how high power distance it is. So for me, first of all, I'm male. Secondly, I'm quite tall, which is also like a threat for some reason that people connect with power distance. And I'm kind of light skinned for in Suriname, even
Got a
though
full package
I'm,
there.
yeah, even though if I'm in the Netherlands, I'm
You're
considered a
considered
person of color.
average.
I'm considered a person of color when I'm in the Netherlands. When I'm in the US, I'm considered Hispanic. So definitely there's enough color there for me to be considered a different race. But when I'm in Suriname, it's I'm light skinned. So those three threats already, people in general are very afraid. Even if I'm very approachable and flexible about it, they're already very afraid to say certain things. You really have to get it out of them. So the high power distance is something that really in Suriname, there are very few companies that have a company culture that break through that. It's really hard to break through it. The individualism is kind of interesting because Suriname scores a little higher than I would expect because I still consider Suriname a very collectivist country. But
I think it comes
compared
with
to
the
Singapore
younger generations,
generation,
especially. I
yeah,
think if you look back 20, 30 years ago, the score would be much lower. But with the rise of, the Gen Z and the exposure to especially Western media,
yeah,
it has
that's
shifted
true. Yeah,
that a lot.
it's much less than Asian countries, I think, which are
Yeah,
much more
definitely.
collective. Also,
Co-
African countries in general are also much more collective. Not all of them. The Western
Oh yeah,
world is
let
much
me
more
bring up
individualistic.
something from Africa, Kenya,
Yeah, okay,
maybe.
that would be interesting.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah,
Kenya's
see,
orange now, so
yeah, okay, but
uh,
yeah, Kenya it kind of already shows that it's much more collective. So Singapore, Kenya are stereotypical Asian countries where there's a high power distance, but still Suriname is much higher in power distance than even those countries. But you see that those are more collectivist countries. And then when you look at masculinity, femininity, then you actually see that Suriname is kind of moving towards a Western kind of mindset along that line, but it's still much more, twice as masculine as the Netherlands. I mean, in Netherlands, it's kind of normal for men to say like, I'm gonna be the stay-at-home dad, and I'm gonna work from home, and I'm gonna clean in the home, and that's kind of a discussion that I have with my wife a lot of the times. The first thing I told her, like, there's certain things that you might consider normal in Dutch culture, which I'm Surinamese, so it's not gonna be normal in Surinamese culture. And when we were just together, like within the first year of our relationship, these are things that I really had to fight through with her to say, like, listen, you might expect this from if you would have a future Dutch husband. These are things that he might do that a future Surinamese husband just won't do. But then there are also instances where I stray away from certain masculine activities. So it's not fully that I'm
yeah,
fully
it doesn't
in a national
necessarily
culture.
mean you're more manly, but it's more like the category of activities that you would associate with more
Yeah,
blunt and straightforward compared to a more caring and
yeah.
nurturing environment.
The idea as well from masculinity, from a relationship perspective, is, and we make fun of this a lot when because recently something came out about like you have to earn at least this much this amount of
Oh
money
yeah, the meme.
to yeah it's kind of it blew up on Facebook, especially in Suriname, because people were offended by the fact that the woman said like, hey, listen, if you don't earn this much, there's always, and she always made a case, there is always love, but I genuinely, the chances are very very small, very slim. But people like to misinterpret that message because she didn't say like it would never happen. She just said like, hey, financially, I need a husband or a partner that at least can provide for me, which is a very masculine opinion or approach. Whereas in Suriname, for instance, we generally do consider that the man in the household is the breadwinner.
Yeah,
It's
the
even
main
even
provider, right?
even though that we're getting much more equality in the workforce when it comes to gender, it's still considered that the man is the breadwinner and he's the main breadwinner and he has to bring in the most money, which is also a mental health issue when you have a Surinamese man who actually earns less than his wife, because this becomes a talking point somewhere in the relationship. It puts a lot of stress on mentally on that man to say like, hey, how can my wife earn more than me? And even though the wife might not care, it's still from the outside perspective, from society, there's still this push like,
Yeah,
hey, you're the
it's
man in the household.
culturally ingrained, basically how you've been grown
Yes,
up, that you are
exactly,
supposed to be the main
exactly.
provider, the protector, the
Yeah, and
you
then we
go out
get
there in the forest to hunt.
yeah, and then we get to the uncertainty avoidance, and there it becomes
This
like,
has a huge
yes.
discrepancy with.
So and this explains what's going on. Actually, for interest's sake, let's remove Kenya and put in Argentina
All right, give me a second. Moving Kenya,
and get Argentina.
Argentina. So
See,
Argentina's orange. Yeah.
yes. So you can already see the similarities when it comes to uncertainty avoidance. uh, the similarities between Suriname and Argentina. Why did I bring this up? Because I think it's very important that there is some socio-economic background into this as well. Because there's a high uncertainty avoidance because of the financial stability of the country as well. I think that
If
plays a major role.
yeah, if you want a more in-depth insight on the state of Argentina, we had a conversation with Nacho. He's from Argentina a few months ago, and he basically told us the affairs how it is in Argentina right now and the ridiculous inflation rates. Basically, we have it better than Argentina if we look at the
And
inflation rate for the
Argentina is
past
not
few
the
years.
only one because
Yeah,
Paco de la Enya, when he told us the run with Bitcoin story, he also mentioned a couple of African countries that have been going through a
could
massive
you elaborate
inflation.
on who Paco is? Because
Yeah, I
we
think we
met him
should
last
get him
week.
in.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we should get him in as a guest. I think that's the best way to introduce him. But I think the interesting part here is that the uncertainty of finance is really high. People are not going to take stupid risk because it could cost them their life, basically. And the consequences of making a move that's uncertain in a situation where you're just surviving, you're not going to be able to, the risk is too high
Yeah,
compared
that
to the
goes
reward.
to basically it plays into why so many people opt in to work in government jobs in because it provides a degree of certainty that you'll be taken care of if you just show up compared to the more Western countries that basically kind of encourages entrepreneurship, taking risk, try to do this. But that's because the whole infrastructure in those countries is to a certain level already of development. So people are more in a better position to take risks, I would say, in a
Okay.
cultural, national sense, coming back to the
Okay.
national
So
identity.
so what does the zero minus one mean? No
No
data
data.
or no
No.
data?
I think the last two categories, especially indulgence, I remember long term orientation was
Yeah,
there,
long term
but
was there, but it
indulgence
wasn't
is
the. But the dungeons is definitely new.
it's a new one.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
I think
definitely new.
it's a lack of data or not enough data to get a score.
Yeah, that would make sense. Okay, so this is
But
kind of
if
yeah,
you had to guess, if you look at the similarities between Argentina and Suriname, I
it
would
would
say
be
the
low.
long term orientation would be
Would be
quite low
low.
as well. Yeah.
Would be low. Would be low. Definitely. So I think this gives us kind of a basis of the talking points that we're talking about, as into when we talk about national identity. Um, it's a starting point to look at the national culture, but the national culture isn't everything. So, and let me kind of go to the second area of interest. Why I brought up this topic, and that has to do also during my studies. I had to choose between the economic benefits of the Olympics for the city that hosts the Olympics. That ended up being the topic that I chose to write about, the paper about. But the other option was the orange feeling, like in sports in the Netherlands, the color orange is kind of the color of the Dutch, right? And it's a really interesting thing because I don't really think, maybe Jamaica a little bit with yellow, but I don't think there's any other country in the world
When I
that.
think Jamaica, I think of green and black first.
Okay, that's interesting. For me, it's yellow. Yellow. The sprinters
Yeah.
always used to have yellow. But there's no country in the world where the country is symbolized in sports by just one singular color.
I can tell you one. New Zealand, it's black.
But black.
Yeah.
Yeah, the All Blacks. They're
Their
also
their
called, yeah,
national like
yeah. But
rugby team.
but New Zealand isn't as big in the world of
No, no.
sports. Like there are certain
But
sports that they're big, the biggest in the world.
yeah,
Uh,
but black
but
is very prominent there.
but black is very prominent.
Yeah.
But I think the orange feeling, and I don't know if for New Zealand it is in everything in all sports. I don't know enough about it, like if it's in athletics, if the New Zealand soccer team also plays with all black. So it's definitely when it comes to rugby,
It's
I'm
definitely
sure
the biggest sport is
the
black,
best
and a lot
black.
of the branding, like the national plant,
Yeah,
the fern, is
yeah.
also colored in black and white.
And I think it also gets less gravitational pull because of the fact that the color black isn't that like
Yeah, it's monochrome. Like,
prominent. So
yeah,
if you would go to a Formula One event right now, because Max Verstappen is the number one Formula One driver at the moment, you will have like a sea of orange. If you would go to a football or soccer event, depending on where you are in the world, only basically the Americans call it soccer. But if you would go to a football event, like anywhere in the world, and the Dutch would be playing, you would see a sea of
orange. Yeah.
orange. I mean, again, the French always also have it with La Bleu, also wearing blue, but it's not as prominent in every
No,
sport.
because orange is not that a common color if you compare the national flags. What flag? Even though the Dutch flag doesn't have orange, they
Because
took
it's
ownership
connected.
of orange
They took the
to
ownership of
the royal
orange
family, right?
because of the royal family. So
Yeah,
it's kind of
the royal
connected,
family.
and the shield
Exactly.
and the lion.
And you'd say no country basically. You blue, red, or I think the most prominent colors if you look at country colors,
Yeah,
blue and red, green
yeah,
to
but
a lesser
it has
extent.
really been an embedded, and also it goes further than sports in the sense that they also celebrate, like when they celebrate King's Day, it's also full orange.
Yeah,
So it's really a national color, right? And
it
it's
it
just
has a lot of historical weight to it as well.
it's a very prominent culture. And it goes further than people think when I think of this culture, because Heineken, while Heineken is not orange and is never connected to orange, Heineken as a Dutch brand, they actually, what they do quite strongly is they're very connected with sports. So there's often a Heineken house at the
Mhm,
Olympics
mhm.
and embedded. And so it's kind of this national culture that gives about like, this is our identity. And it is interesting to see like how other countries approach it. We talked about Les Bleus, the All Black, New Zealand as well. So there are definitely cultures that have a similar concept, but none of them are as strongly embedded as the Dutch with orange.
Yeah,
And
I can agree with it.
and if you move to the US, you will definitely see that level of fandom on a regional or a state-based scale or even a city scale.
Well, in the US, it's more related to the politics, right? It's either red or blue.
No, but I'm going a little bit further with sports and really a sense of belonging and identity, and that's much more connected to your localization. And it's
Yeah,
interesting because
but
you
can
have
you
that.
compare a country like the Netherlands versus 50 states of the US? Because
So
it's more
here's what's
fragmented,
interesting.
right?
No, but the reason I bring this up is because another reason we got into this topic is in the late 90s, there was a movie quite popular with one of the Wayans brothers called Celtic Pride. And Celtic Pride was this movie about two diehard Boston Celtics fans. And you have to imagine Boston is Celtics is green. Everything is green.
Yeah, it's Celtic culture.
Yeah, exactly. So that's why I bring it up as well. And the movie is about two fans, Celtics diehard fans, that end up kidnapping a opposing player. So they're so into their sports fandom that they, and of course it's a comedy, they kidnap like the star player from the other team. And that's what the movie's about. And that's also part of their pride. So that was originally why I came up with the name Pride instead of patriotism. But then Pride is now much more connected to other things. So we ended up with patriotism. So why do I bring these two topics up? Is because we just had a really record-setting successful sports weekend with Suriname. We had a situation where we haven't been in decades, where Isama Senga just won the 100 and the 200 meter sprint at the South American Games. And in spectacular fashion, breaking the youth world record for the 100-meter sprint. So there's a bit of a story behind that, which I'm shortly going to explain to give a little bit more context.
Yes, please, because I'm not that first.
Okay.
I think I saw some people share it, but I
Oh yeah,
haven't
it
been
was
there.
massively shared, and that's why I'm getting into this. So um, Isama Senga, basically, his parents are two Olympians. So his dad is Tommy Asenga. Tommy Asenga still holds the Surinamese record for the 800, the 400, 800, and 1500 meters in athletics, and participated for Suriname in three Olympic Games in '88 in Seoul, '92 Barcelona, and '96 Atlanta. And his wife and the mother of Isam was a Zambian sprinter who also participated in multiple Olympics in the '92 and the '96 Olympics. So just imagine two Olympians meeting at the Olympic Games, getting two children, a son and a daughter. The daughter's a little bit older, is also into athletics, is also a professional on her way to become a full-time professional athlete. And the children had to decide. Basically, they grew up their whole life in the US. Their dad is from Suriname, their mother is from Zambia. And they wanted to get the Surinamese nationality to compete for Suriname, but also to compete for South America. That's something that Isam revealed that many of us we didn't think about that. But Africa is kind of well known for their athletes.
Yeah.
South America much less, like much less. So aside from Isam also saying like, hey, listen, I came to Suriname so often. I came with my dad. I love the country. I want to do something back for the country. But also for South America, saying like, we don't have a lot of South American athletes that really stand out. Or in swimming, definitely. Bruno Frates, I think, is one of the top swimmers in the world, and there are definitely some others. And Brazil is big, so there are Brazilian athletes who compete at the top level. But most of the South American countries, especially in athletics, we don't really count. Up until this weekend, past weekend, we never had a South American sprinter run 100 meters within 10 seconds. Now we have three, and Isam was the fastest of those three.
So
Yeah,
I want to bring up our pushback, maybe a more controversial takes. So they grew up in the US, from what I hear, right? And
that's correct.
do they have the Surinamese nationality or the US nationality? Is that
They have a sports passport, which has been introduced, I think, 5 years ago or something, or maybe a little bit longer, a little bit shorter, which allows people from Surinamese origin to compete under the
to
flag of Suriname.
represent the country if
Yes.
you have that? Okay, that
Yeah.
makes sense.
Yeah.
So I would the way I see it, just looking at it objectively, it's if you're competing in the US or the more populated locations, you are swimming between the masses. Whereas if you represent a lesser, uh, um, a smaller region or a lesser known region, your name becomes more prominent, right? It gets more recognition. People, because you represent not only the country Suriname, but the whole of South America or Latin America, you basically get lifted up for that whole continent. So that might be a strategic choice as well, compared to if you would compete in the US, where you have tens or hundreds of people that compete on that same level or better because of the situation they have there. So
Okay.
that's kind of how I'm
Okay.
reviewing it
It's
just
true.
from
It's true.
hearing your
What
story.
what Timothy says, big fish, small pond. But here's the thing, though. Isam is the fastest high school athlete ever, even in the US. That's something to consider. Another thing to consider: the last time somebody made it to Olympics finals and wasn't born in Suriname was Anthony Nesty. Anthony Nesty was born in Trinidad, competed for Suriname, won gold, and another medal this Olympics after that. Doesn't get any recognition aside the biggest indoor stadium being named after him. Ends up becoming the swim coach for the U.S. men's national team, now the assistant swim coach, and is at least 5 years in a row the best NCAA coach in the US. And we don't do anything with it. Like we post about it, but we don't really understand like that he's basically the biggest person in men's swimming, like globally. Like we don't understand that. Letitia Friesde still holds an athletics record regionally for I think the 800 meters, which has been there for 30 years. And she doesn't get the recognition locally as well. And this is exactly where I'm going because I'm bringing this up because not of Asenga, who is definitely, he's 18 years old, by the way. He's 18 years old. He beat out the biggest US contender in the 200 meters this year. He is the fastest youth athlete in the world ever. So this is somebody that we have to understand that we're gonna treasure him for the rest of our lives. As long as he's competing, like he's always going to be like one of the contenders. Whether it's at the Olympics, whether it's at the Pan Am Games, whether it's at the South American Games, he's always going to be the biggest contender. He runs 100 meters about literally a second faster than the current national champion. Just to put in context how
Yeah,
extremely
right.
fast
And
this guy
a
is.
second is a
It's a
long
lot.
time if you're taking
In a
swimming and athletics.
yes, it's a lot. So we have to embrace that. But it comes back to the identity, the national identity. And the reason I bring this up because we are also quite invested in our national football team. And with the football team for last 3 4 years, really, we have been pushing to get professional players that play in England, play in the Netherlands, play in Belgium, play in France, the big European competitions, Turkey, whatever, even Israel. We've been trying to get them to Suriname to play for Suriname. And the biggest issue that we have, and I think that's why it's easier for individual sports than for team sports. The biggest issue is that we have is when they all come together, they don't have enough time to
Yeah,
get
to
used to each other.
practice with each other and get to know them
And so
and
far, all of the
foster that
coaches,
team.
yeah,
Yeah.
so far, all of the coaches, all of Surinamese diaspora play a certain system, which is called the Ajax system, which is one of the most renowned clubs in the Netherlands. And they play a certain system, a certain kind of game where that's kind of what all the coaches play when they coach the national football team of Suriname. And it doesn't translate into winning at the moment. I think that's the biggest problem. So when Dean Gore came, there was a big boost, a massive boost, and after that, no other coach has been able to replicate it, which kind of makes us anxious. We're worried. We don't fully comprehend or understand what's going on. And when we don't fully understand what's going on or can't comprehend it, we get agitated and angry.
And if you had to relate this back to the Hofstede, is it the risk thing?
No, it's a different style. It's a collectivist style of play. So you have to understand in sports, in Suriname, it's a very, even though it's a collectivist thing, it's also a higher power distance. So we might think it's an individualistic thing, as in the leaders are individualistic, which is not the case. It's much more of a power distance thing where there's such a respect in hierarchy between the person who is on top and the person that's down there. And for some reason in diaspora, this also plays a role because we are constantly looking like we need to get the best player that plays on the highest division in
Mm.
Europe is more important to us as fans than it actually is that the team matches
Fostering the,
well.
the, the local talent and
No, no,
has
no.
good
You
synergy.
don't have to foster. It's about the synergy of the team.
Yeah, yeah. I mean the synergy, fostering the
Yeah.
synergy. Right?
And why do I bring this up? because what also happened this weekend is that the men's national volleyball team won the Caribbean Cup for the second straight time. And this men's national team won the Caribbean Cup with a team of players that all play locally at the moment. They all play in the local competition. Whereas other teams from the Caribbean brought in star players that play professionally in European leagues to strengthen the squad. And we did that previously as well. It just happens that those players who played professionally abroad have been here, came back before COVID, and didn't leave again. But
Right.
the cohesion of the team, and it was almost like they played with a chip on their shoulder because part of the team already went through the process in 2018 of winning a Caribbean championship, which was the first time Suriname did it ever. But they were able to pull it off with all local players
Yeah,
because the
yeah,
cohesion of the team and everybody, they even said it. We did an extra podcast yesterday where the two of the star players explained that people took on different roles and nobody was like, I'm not sure I can do this. No, everybody took on the role they were most suited for to win. And why do I bring this up? Because I spent a lot of time on sports, but it's kind of a bridge to where we are as a country. We have to figure now, on one side, we need as much help from outside as possible. Like if you're a developing country and you have people living abroad, you need their expertise. Don't get me wrong, the men's volleyball team from Suriname that just won the Caribbean Cup was coached by a Cuban through a
Mm,
Cuban volleyball philosophy to win the
that's
Caribbean Cup.
interesting.
It's a really interesting thing to understand that we actually had a Cuban that um, brought his philosophy and it works for us. It clearly works for us. Maybe even better than having a Dutch or a European coach that wants to play a
Yeah,
certain system.
because it's closer to home and closer to
It
the
feels,
culture,
but
the
but
collectivism.
yeah. So, but is it really? So that's something to take in consideration. And when you translate that to how to run a country, and getting the diaspora involved and getting people with Surinamese. Like there's so many people who are not only it's hard to call them diaspora because they have a Surinamese passport. They live abroad and they invest and they want to be part of Suriname. But there's so much of a cultural difference that there's a barrier because you can't just say like, "Hey, I'm Surinamese," and I still am Surinamese, and you have to understand it goes two ways because the Surinamese person that's living abroad thinks totally different from Surinamese
Yeah,
person living here.
and the acceptance for the people locally, it's kind of harder to accept that. I would say.
No, you have to
Or
be able to understand each other's language, and that's why a national culture is a national identity is so hard for us. Because aside from the fact that there's a difference in how you think when you live in a Western country like the Netherlands and US, just for ease of an example, and the way you think when you live in Suriname or in a developing country is completely different. Even for me, my thought process is completely different when I live in the Netherlands or in the US. First, if I would live in the US or live in the Netherlands versus living in Suriname, the thought process is completely different. I'm quickly gonna dive in to this comment about Renzo, and Renzo has been getting a lot of heat for this, but this is one of the hardest topics to talk about. So for those that don't know, Renzo Chanayu is a Surinamese swimmer, Surinamese
we
athlete.
also have an
Ice skater.
episode with him, I
Exactly.
think a year or two ago. So
Yes.
just search Renzo
And
Ganayu on Confoes
on
and you'll
social
find it.
confos, and you find him. And in our interview, the interview that he did with us, he was very hesitant to bring up the issues that he really faced preparing for the last Olympics. So you have to understand, Renzo swam a personal best in, was it 2014, the Olympics of 2014, was really pushing, won his heat, was pushing. And Renzo was actually coached by Anthony Nesty before that Olympics. And achieved, he didn't achieve as much as maybe he wanted to, but toward our expectations were, he definitely overachieved. In comparison with Jürgen Thema, who made the A limit, so got to the Olympics on his own, was in a heat with Usain Bolt, and was not fully prepared for the Olympics the way he should have been because he had to scrap, he had to work to find money to be able to go to the Olympics, just not getting any support. So people have to understand that. So in 2014, Jurgen Temo, a 100-meter sprinter from Suriname, was the only one who directly qualified and didn't need a wild card for the selection of Suriname. And he had to work and clean just to be able to afford to go to the Olympics. So while others athletes were prepping and getting ready to go to perform at their max, their absolute max, our best athlete for that year was working just to be able to make the payments to go to the Olympics. That kind of already tells the difference. So then Renzo goes into um, then Renzo goes into the 2008, 2008, 2000, also was 16, by the way, Olympics of 2016, not 2014. Then Renzo prepares in Suriname for the Olympics of 2021. Because of COVID, it jumped to 21. Um, and he didn't want to say it because he was extremely grateful for the fact that he was able to practice in the best facilities that we have in Suriname. But the facilities were not equipped to Olympic standards. So he could never, in his whole preparation, run an actual race in a swimming pool that was similar to the Olympic swimming pool. Which means in his preparation, even though Renzo himself for the previous Olympics did meet the direct qualification limits, he was not able to practice in a proper
Yes, yes.
facility. And it's hard to say, but it's the truth. Now, after the Olympics, he moved to the Netherlands and started swimming there. And we saw immediate improvement. Within a year after the Olympics, he broke the national record multiple times. He became the Dutch champion. And he's now on a pace that's good enough to, on a good day, reach the top 16, maybe the final at the Olympics if he would swim for the Netherlands. If we would swim for Suriname, under the conditions, the training conditions that we have here, we don't have the $50,000 equipment that they use in the Netherlands to monitor how you move underwater, to make small adjustments that help you with half of a second to be faster, half of a second. We don't have that. So for him, first of all, the Dutch invested a lot of money into him for research and development purposes to get better. So that's one reason why he could be able should be able to come out from Netherlands, even though it breaks our heart, and even breaks his heart because he wants to represent Suriname. But the opportunities that he's being provided are so much better in the Netherlands. And the second thing that is not being brought up, and I'm not sure it's why it's not being brought up, because people don't consider that a real option. The Dutch have three swimmers um, that are capable of doing a top 16 time on their perspective speciality, and it happens to be the same. One is Kenzo Simmons, who's also basically from Surinamese descent. The second one is Renzo. And the third one is the Dutchman who actually swam in the Olympic finals the last time around in the Olympics, in the previous Olympics. So technically, they just need a fourth, and then they could also do the 100-meter relay, which would make them an instant contender. So not only
Right.
can Renzo have an opportunity to swim in an Olympic final, if the Dutch would play their cards right, he might be able to swim in two Olympic finals. And just the thought of that, for me personally, from an objective perspective, not from a patriotic perspective, but from an objective perspective, should be already enough to say, like, hey, it's worth considering. But we get offended by the idea so much. But we're not being fair because if you look at Jair Chonefa, Jair Chonefa at the previous Olympics came in fourth. He was the first Surinamese athlete in an Olympic finals since Anthony Nesty. We have to understand that Letitia Friste still has records. Letitia Friste has over 40 medals. Letitia Friste is like one of the biggest household names in Suriname and in the world of athletics, but she never ran an Olympic final. And Jair Chonefa was in an Olympic final. So people don't understand like how special that
It's
is.
yeah, it's a different scaling, right, or category in its own,
Yeah.
basically, or on what you're known for.
And how did he get there? Because the UCE, the cycling federation, gave him a scholarship to
I'm saying,
train at their cycling center. So this just to put in perspective what we're dealing here. So we're dealing in one hand with investments that are done by other countries instead of Suriname for athletes to be able to represent Suriname on the highest level. So that's one aspect. And the second aspect is when it comes to team sports, the dynamic is different because when you have people that have to come from everywhere in the world together and to unite as being one team from one country, you need better chemistry. So here's the thing. Yeah, the Olympics is about, I'm definitely agreeing with it. It is about patriotism, not about individual success. But we have to differentiate between individual sports and team sports. So I think that's the biggest difference that we may have to make. So for individual sports, it's kind of easy. And that's interesting as well because we have Ivanildo Metendorf and we have Donovan Wissa, who are local Surinamese fighters that train and live in Suriname and are world champions. So for some sports, it's possible to live in Suriname. Of course, Ivanildo does go to Thailand to practice there whenever he has a bout coming up. But in general, they live in Suriname and they do their sports in Suriname and they become world champions. So it's possible. But for other sports, especially when it comes to cycling, when it comes to swimming, there's a certain like plateau, and once you want to go up there, you need some kind of support from outside of our
yeah,
country.
because if I had to compare those types of sports that you mentioned, like the swimming, the athletic, the cycling, it's a non-contact sport. It's basically you're performing versus another person, basically on your individual peak performance. You cannot adapt to the other person, whereas a contact sport like or martial arts or boxing, you basically can adapt to the other person. You can use their strengths or weaknesses against them, and likewise for yourself too. And I'm no professional martial artist, but if you get knocked out to the right spot in your head with the right force, it doesn't matter how much you train. One small mistake can make the difference from a winning and not. Whereas
Yeah.
the microseconds that count in cycling, athletics, and swimming, it's another level. That's why they need those facilities to measure every movement in your body, every fiber, how your blood pumps in your body
And I
to
also
the
think it's
minuscule.
yeah, there's also a difference between sports that you have a winner, which is not decided by time, versus sports where you the winner is decided by time, right? So to quickly close off this segment and go into the final segment of today's episode is the issue that we have in sports with being able to unify and bring teams together and decide what kind of culture do we want to play, because that's one of the things. Of course, when you have professional athletes in this case football players that play professionally at a higher level, the basic knowledge, the basic skill set of those players is better. But when you compete on a national level or international level, there's also a sense of chemistry that a team needs to have to be successful. And what kind of chemistry does that need to be? And then you get into a little bit of a politics and how to run a country. Because within our country, we're suffering with the same thing. And that's that there are different national cultures within our national culture. So that makes it kind of difficult as well, if you understand what I mean with that.
Yeah. Would it be fairer to say we have different uh, ethnical cultures
Yeah,
within the national culture. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. You can say that way. So when you understand that a country like Suriname, and we're quite extreme for a developing country to have that many influences, because we have former slaves, ethnicities from the slavery period. We have
Okay.
migrant
So
workers. So it's a
on
very
that
much a
point,
mix. Yeah.
I want to bring one last point before we close off. In one of the strengths that often gets brought up for us is the diversity, the mix, and the distribution of the diversity that we have here, right? It's often called something to be thankful for. It's kind of remarkable that we don't have that. No, if you just had two ethnicities where one is has more power than the other, or there's more rivalry. In that sense, how would you differ this multicultural from something like the US? Because they are also very a hotpot of multiculture. Maybe not on a state level, but
Okay.
that's also something that's
You
kind of
also mentioned, you already
branded there.
mentioned, you already mentioned that the biggest divider in the US is the left and the right, it's the Republicans and the Democrats, right? So basically, that division between those two groups is so big that it kind of totally overshadows the ethnicities. So I think that's
Okay,
the reason. So we
okay,
could go
that's
that
a
we
yeah,
could
no,
go that
that's a fair
approach.
point.
Yeah, we could go that approach and create like this cum, what I was trying to say, communism kind of party, and then you have on the other side you have the capitalistic party, and you have the communism fighting against capitalists, and like all groups just start
I
going
think
like,
they
ah, we're
prefer
this.
socialist. I think
Yeah,
they prefer socialist instead of communist.
yeah, almost like communism in a sense. It's more, for me, it's personally more communism than socialism, even if they think
I,
it's socialism.
I get what you mean, yeah, but
But yeah, like the main philosophical points are more communist than socialist. But it's true. But that's something that could happen, but we don't gravitate towards. I think one of the positives about how many cultures we and how many ethnicities we have is that we have a little bit more empathy towards other ethnicities, towards rituals, towards culture. We are more empathic. But one of the things that makes it more difficult is that in order to really grow, you have to align first. And it's really hard to align with when there are too many subsets. And I think that's the biggest issue. Like you can align easier if there are two trains of thought and you just decide which train of thought is better. But when you have like 5 to 7 trains of thought, it becomes
yeah,
really hard to make decisions,
uh,
right? It just becomes really hard to make decisions. And we have to decide like, okay, it's great to have patriotism, and patriotism is also different for different people. But if you want to go towards a national identity, you have to be okay with saying like, hey, we have to be vulnerable to understand that the way that we consume and the way that we think is not the only way, and we have to go towards a nationalistic way. I know that if I go to certain parts, even of Paramaribo, that people would think that I'm an outsider. And when I start speaking them with them for longer than 5 minutes, they will understand like,
yeah.
no,
Oh, yeah, you're local.
he's a local, right? And you still have to find like where's the common ground. And right now we're not working towards common ground. We're just defending our differences. And on the one hand, we're lucky because that defending of differences is much smaller than in other countries, but we're still way too divided to really grow and really create a national identity. And that's something we don't talk about because it's hard, because it takes so
It's
much time.
confrontational.
It's very confrontational. So we do have to think, what's our national identity? And to go full circle on this, right now we're focused on oil and gas. Like oil and gas is like the main focus. And then now and then we start realizing like, hey, carbon credits is a thing. We're the most forested country in the world. But
In percentage.
in percentage, but we don't want to have the discussion like, Hey, hold on a second. Y- The national identity of oil and gas and the national identity of being the most forested country in the world, it's not, it's really
It's
schizophrenic.
very, yeah, it's very polar
It's
opposites.
very polar opposites. We don't have that conversation. We don't have the conversation that even though we have so much success in sports right now, like sports is like has been for the last 10 years the major topic of positive highlights, but we refuse to create a policy that embraces long-term policy making for sports and support for sports. We don't commit to that. We don't take it as part of our national identity. We'll just watch people do brilliant stuff and say like, hey, we're proud of that, but we didn't contribute to Isam Asenga winning 2 medals at the South American Games. As a country, we had single contribution. We did have a very big contribution for Suriname winning the Caribbean Cup because it was held in Suriname and people showed up and cheered for them. And the crowd, even though maybe the players from Suriname didn't feel it as much, our opponents did feel it. They
Mhm.
felt the hostile
It,
environment.
it's a moral thing, like
But we have to start consider if we talk about national identity, that we should start building towards a national identity. Like there's only one political party that I feel truly, well, there are two, but the other one people don't because it's so small at the moment. But there's really one party that pushes the national identity agenda as part of their campaign, whereas other political parties are much towards an ethnic approach, much more towards certain smaller subsets and subgroups within our society. And we have to understand that policy wise, we need to be much more integrated.
agreed, agreed. And it's hard, it's confrontational. And as we go back to the beginning, as we explored the Hof state framework on how the culture is formed, it's stuff we need to think about, and not just think about, have conversation about, and to get that alignment. And that's usually the challenge with any community. Basically, you can see the national country as a community on a larger scale, and getting that alignment is always tough. But that should not keep us from trying and having the conversation. With that being said, this was another episode of Social Convos. As we mentioned in the beginning, follow us on YouTube, youtube.com/at Confoes. We're also on IG at Confoes and Threads if it's still alive, because the IG account is linked to that. Not so optimistic on that. And also, in the meantime, if you check out our Substack, you can already subscribe at confoes.substack.com for some goodies. We're not going to spoil it yet, but just go there if you made it to the end of this episode and see what happens. With that being said, Shanduk, roll us out.
This was Social Confos. I'm glad, and Diego's glad that you joined us for a new episode. We hope to see you back here next week. Bye bye. Swai swai.